Now we're on Daf Kuf Vav Amud Beis, Sharei Onshom Amur. We have a clear-cut pasuk which tells us that if both the Hakdasha and the Hakrova were both implemented during the time of an Isur Bamos, then for sure he's chayav for doing such a thing. As the Torah says, Al Pesach Ohel Moed. Now, that's only the Onish, because the Torah says there that he's chayav kares. However, as Hora, I even have a lotaseh, because again, we're relying on the principle that we learned in Amud Aleph, that Hishomer Lecha is a language of lotaseh, and Ksiv, Hishomer Lecha Petala L'Secha. So right away we have a lav. But Mikan Vielech, but let's say, for example, Zevachim Shekadisha B'Shas Heter Bamos, he did Akdasha, and he set aside a carbon at a time when he's allowed to be makrivin on a bama, but a krivin b'shas isur bamas, and then subsequently they established the mishkan, and he's not allowed to do so. So the Gemara is going to say that we're going to derive that from a pasuk shenemar leman asher yaviu bnei Yisrael zivcheim asher heim zovchim. And the Torah seems to be talking about the fact that they are allowed to bring the zevach, and that's why it says asher heim zovchim, zvachim sheitarti lecha kvar. And I already gave you a heter for those zvachim. Meaning, at that point, when he did the Akdasha, he had a heter to offer that carbon on a bama, because there was no mishkat at that point. But then the Torah says, al pnei asada. Al pnei asada means that now he's not allowed to be makriv on a bama. They established the mishkan. Lomer l'cha, we can derive from this, as over pashas isur bamas, olav hakosov ki'ilu, mal olav hakosov ki'ilu hikriv al pnei asada. Now, al pnei asada is an allusion to avodah zarah. So it's as if he worshipped avodah zarah. Because when there's an isur bamos, then the Torah equates avodah on a bama, hakrav on a bama, to avodah zarah. Ve'viam lashem. And now the Torah is saying that when there is a heter bamos, then you're commanded with a mitzvah, and you fulfill that mitzvah by bringing hevium for the sake of Hashem, because it's now we're talking about a heter bamos, and it's not avodah zarah, it's lashem. But zu mitzvah saseh, the Torah is only giving me a positive command. That doesn't tell me that he's going to be chayiv kares, because to be chayiv kares, you have to have a lotas. Is therefore lotas binalan. And now we're in deep trouble, because Talmud Lomar v'lo yizbechu od, the same pasuk that we wanted to use for shchutei chutz, is now being used for a case in which he was magdish the carbon b'shas heter bamos, and he was makriv the carbon b'shas isur bamos. Yachol yehe onosh kares. Now we know if he did both Akdasha and Akrova b'shas isur bamos he's chayiv kares, what is the punishment in the case where his Akdasha was valid? It was done with all the permissibility in the world because it was a shas heter bamos. Is Yachol yehe onosh kares? So we think now if he goes ahead and he sacrifices it after the Mishkan was established, and now it's shas isur bamos, he's going to be chayiv. And chayav here means kares. Talmud Lomer, the Torah says, there's a special miyud here in the pasuk that's teaching me that he's not chayav kares, but he is chayav alav. So we see that the lotas in this very unique scenario in which he was magdashit b'shas heter bamos, and he was makriv it after the isur bamos was chal, he's chayav alav, and that's derived from the pasuk yizbechu od. So therefore, the pasuk is no longer free to derive the iser of shchutei chutz. Ella, so now the Gemara has to come up with another approach entirely. And the premise or the concession of this approach that we're about to learn is that Enochinami, there is no pasuk that prohibits with a lav or lo or pen or hishamelcha as far as shchita chutz, but rather it's derived from a logical analysis called a kal v'chomer. Ela Omar Abaye kal v'chomer. Uma b'makom shelo onash hizir makom sha'onash eno din shehizir. In the case of a carbon, b'shas heter bamas, that he was magdish, and then he went ahead and he brought that carbon after they'd established the Mishkan when it's shas isur bamas, and he's chai for a lav, but not for kares. And that's called in the language of Abaye, Mokum Shalo Onash is here. He has a lotase here in this scenario, but not an Onish Kares. Is Mokum Shalo Onash Enu Din Shehizir. The Torah itself has already taught us that if he does the Shechita Bachutz, he's Chayiv Kares. The Chayiv Kares, if you remember, the Onish, was explicit in the Torah. Of course, that pasuk in Parakid Zion. So how much more so should he be chayiv for violating a lav here if he's chayiv kares? If he's chayiv for a lav in the case of bama, when there is no chayiv kares, how much more so should he be chayiv for a lav where there is an isur kares, an onish kares? Amalei Ravina Rav Ashim Kain, if that be the case, if you're saying that we can use the method of derivation called the kal v'chomer to derive isurim and lotas says is lo yomer lav b'chelev. Why did the Torah have to bother saying that you're not allowed to eat chelev? Teisi kal v'chomer nevela. Chelev is more chomer than nevela because chelev is a chiv kares and nevela is only an isur la. Is my nevela shlo onash hizir? Is chelev sha'onash enu din shehizir? If in the case of nevela, the Torah gives you a prohibition, thou shalt not eat nevela, lo sochlu kol nevela, even though there's no chiyuv kares, if you eat the nevela and you violate that lav, then in the case of chelev, where the Torah spells out that you're chayiv kares for eating nevela, for eating chelev, then certainly the Torah prohibits eating chelev. So from the fact that the Torah found it necessary to state and formulate the lav of eating chelev, kol chelev lo tochal, that proves that you cannot use a kal v'chomer to derive a lav. The lav has to be explicit in the Torah. If you could derive a lav from a kal v'chomer, then we would derive the lav of chelev from nevela. Also, Kami de Rava, when this presentation came in front of Rava, he said to him, Nevela lo asya, I can find you a chumrah in Nevela that it doesn't exist in chelev. Nevela, although it doesn't generate kares, but nevertheless, there's something called tumas nevela. If an animal dies and you come in contact with the carcass of the animal, then you are contaminated, which is not the case of chelev. You can touch chelev, you can wash your body with chelev, whatever you want to do with the chelev, and you're not tameh. So now the Gemara says, you know what? I'm going to ask another kasha on Rava. If Rava thinks that you can use a kal v'chomer to derive a lav, mishratzim tmeim. Let's derive the isur lav of eating chelev from the fact that Torah prohibits eating certain shrotzim. So the answer is that at least to defend Abai, that this is not a valid kal v'chomer, meaning I have a pirch on this kal v'chomer because mal shvatzim tmeish mitamim v'mashu. Right? You have categories of shvatzim where the Torah says that if you come in contact with the smallest part of a sheretz, you contract tumah. And once again, chelev doesn't generate tumah. So once again, says Rava, if Abaye you're correct, then we're going to derive a lav from a kal v'chomer mishrotzim tahorim. What about those shrotzim? There are, I think, shmona shrotzim that the Torah says that frogs, ants, he gives examples here that although they're forbidden for consumption, but nevertheless, they do not transmit tumah. And therefore, if the Torah prohibits eating these shrotzim, then how much more so would the Torah prohibit eating chelev, which is an Isur Kares? And you can't say, well, these shrotzim are metame, and that's a pircha, because these are shrotzim Torah. So the answer is that we have another pircha, mal shrotzim Torah, sheisur b'mashu. You're chayav malchus for violating the lav of eating a sheretz, even if you eat the smallest amount. He says here, the size of ke'adasha. Ke'adasha is a lentil. But in chelev, you're not chayav unless you eat a kezayis, the size of an olive. So we see clearly that there's a chumrah in shrotzim that doesn't exist in chelev. So the Gemara says, well, maybe you'll say me'orla v'kiloya kerem. Let's take other isurim that the Torah prohibits and derive chelev from orla, from kiloya kerem. No, we have a pirch again. Mali orla kiloya kerem shken asurim v'hana. Chelev is only also b'achila, not b'hana. Mishvius. So let's derive the isur lav of chelev from shvius. No. That too has a pircha. Why? Because malish shvius shekei tofeses domer. There's a separate halach in shvius of tfisas domer. So, for example, if I sell you shvius, then the money itself that I get in exchange for the shvius becomes sanctified with kedusha shvius. If one sells shvius produce, the money assumes kedusha shvius. Now, if you sell chelev, the money that you get for selling chelev from the buyer is not tofis damim. It doesn't have any din of chelev. Be truma. Let's say we'll derive from the lav of truma. Now, I'm not exactly sure how you could derive from truma, because in truma there's an isur chiyuv bisa b'dei shamayim. So that I don't know. But right now the Gemara is focused on kares, and there's no kares for a zar who eats truma. And then I'm going to slug that up by saying shekain lo hutar michlola. There's a chumrah in truma that a zar could never, ever, ever eat truma, whereas in chelev, you're allowed to eat chelev, and that's the case of chaya. Chelev of a chaya, like a deer, is permissible. Mikulo nami, shekain lo hutro michlolin. Now that we figured out that chelev has a kula, and it's permitted in the case of chelev of a chaya, then all the kal v'chomers that we had before all fall off, because they're all chamur, and you can't derive a lav from that which is chamur to that which is kal, and the kula of chelev is that chelev is mutter to from a chaya. Omar Rava. Now Rava is going to slug up a bay for a different reason. Kasha ha-kasha. Forget about all these discussions about kal v'chomers, ahin and erik. Hodisnan, the Mishnah says in Psachim, Pesach umila mitzvahs aseh, These are the only two mitzvahs say which generate kares if you don't fulfill these mitzvahs say. Is teise b'kavachomer mimosir, right? The halacha is that if a person is allowed to burn the meat of a carbon within a certain allotted time, or allowed to eat, in the case of the Kohanim, within a certain time, and if he passes that prescribed time, then that becomes nosar. Isma mosir shelo onash hizir. The Torah does not impose a chiv kares for what? For one who leaves over the sacrifice. He violates the Isur of Lo Sosir Meruad Boker. He's not chayav kares for that. But he is chayav for violating a law. Is Pesach u'Mila shal onash, in the case of Pesach and Mila, where he's chayav kares, is eno din shehizir. He says here, we do not derive a prohibition concerning the Pesach if he didn't bring the Pesach, or Mila if he didn't circumcise himself. It means that you can't derive a lo taseh from a kal v'chomer. And Omer of Ashi Amrita l'shmaita kamid Rav Kahana, the Omer Levi Mosa lo Asya. You cannot derive any conclusions from Nosar regarding the Pesach and Mila. Tikul mifrach malav mosir shekain ein lo takon. Right, in the case of Pesach, the Torah is makil, and if you didn't bring the Pesach Rishon, you bring in Pesach Sheni. And in the case of Mila, you'll always have a chance to do Mila. But in the case of Nosar, once you leave over the sacrifices, then that's it. There's no way of being mitaken, of rectifying that which was left over. It's Nosar. It's a chiyuv kares if you eat it. Tomer bePesach sheyesh lo takon. So he says here, since the law concerning one who leaves over is more stringent in that respect, so we have a pircha because ein lo takon, and no kal v'chomer could be drawn to the Pesach or circumcision. But where the kal v'chomer could be possible and there's no pircha, then perhaps we could derive a lo taseh from a kal v'chomer. And now the Gemara goes back to the basics and attacks Abaye from the basics for chimasir min adin. Abaye is assuming that you could derive a lo taseh from a logical kal v'chomer. Even though there is such a man the Omer who says that we could derive punishment min adin, but ein mazhir min adin. Everybody concedes that you have to have a lav in the Torah. You can't derive a lav from a lo taseh. A lo taseh, for example, in the case of shchutei chutz, cannot be derived from a kal v'chomer. Even if you want to derive it from, let's say, bamos, doesn't matter. There's no such thing as deriving a lo taseh from a kal v'chomer. And this is a sugya in Masechta Makos that the Gemara quotes here in Zevachim. Kid Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan asya avo malal lo onash elim kain hizir afkan lo onash elim kain hizir. Okay, then. So this is where we'll start. All right. So we should hear better news and.